She was 17 years old, standing in the middle of a house that used to smell like her father's cologne, and she had nothing. Not a room. Not a meal. Not a single person who would look her in the eyes and tell her it was going to be okay. The woman sleeping in her father's bed had taken everything, and nobody, not the lawyers, not the neighbors, not the relatives who came to the funeral and cried loud tears, nobody came back. Nobody checked on her. And the worst part? She had no idea just how much had already been stolen from her. This is the story of Zara Williams, and I need you to stay with me until the very end, because what happened to this girl will break your heart before it restores your faith in humanity. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Zara Williams was born in Atlanta, Georgia, the only child of Marcus Williams, a self-made man who had built a real estate empire from absolutely nothing. Marcus grew up poor, the kind of poor where you learn to stretch one meal into two and smile through the hunger so your mother doesn't worry. He carried that hunger with him, but not in a bitter way. He carried it like fuel. By the time Zara was born, Marcus had already built 3 apartment complexes in the metro Atlanta area. By the time she was 10, he had expanded into commercial real estate and was worth somewhere close to $40 million. But Marcus was not the kind of man who let money change who he was at his core. He still drove the same route to church every Sunday. He still called his old friends from the neighborhood. And more than anything else, he raised Zara with his hands-on, present, warm, the kind of father who showed up to every school play, who kept her drawings on his office wall, who would sit at the kitchen table with her every morning and ask her what she was dreaming about. Zara loved her father in the way that a child loves someone who feels like the whole world wrapped in one person. Her mother had passed away when Zara was just 4 years old, a sudden illness that took her quietly and left Marcus to grieve and raise his daughter alone. He did both with an incredible amount of grace. For several years, it was just the two of them, and Zara had grown up feeling completely secure in that. Then, when Zara was 12, Marcus met Diane. Diane Carter was polished in a way that felt rehearsed, the kind of woman who smiled just long enough for you to feel comfortable before her eyes moved on to something else in the room. She was 41, divorced, no children of her own, and she had a talent for reading people, for finding what they needed and offering exactly that. With Marcus, she was soft and attentive. She laughed at his jokes. She asked questions about his childhood. She cooked on Sundays and wore simple dresses and said all the right things about family and legacy. Marcus, a man who had been lonely for 8 years without fully admitting it to himself, fell in love with her. He truly did. And when he sat Zara down at 13 to tell her he was thinking about marrying Diane, Zara looked at her father's face, that warm, hopeful face, and she said, "If she makes you happy, Daddy, then I'm happy too." She meant it. She really did. But even then, something sat quietly in the back of her chest, the way a draft comes through a window you thought was closed. Diane moved in 6 months before the wedding. At first, it was small things. The kind of small things that, if you mentioned them, would make you sound ungrateful or difficult. Diane would serve dinner and give Zara slightly less on her plate. When Zara spoke at the table, Diane would redirect the conversation to herself within 2 sentences. She would walk past Zara without acknowledging her, as if she were a piece of furniture. Zara would sometimes catch Diane watching her from across the room with an expression that had no warmth in it at all, just a kind of quiet calculation. But whenever Marcus was in the room, Diane became soft again. She would touch Zara's shoulder and call her sweetheart and ask her about school. And Marcus would smile, relieved that his 2 girls were getting along. Zara didn't want to hurt her father, so she said nothing. She smiled back. She went to her room and wrote in her journal about the feeling she couldn't name. They got married when Zara was 14. And the week after the wedding, something shifted in the house, quietly but completely. The change didn't come with a dramatic scene or a raised voice. It came the way weather changes, almost imperceptibly, until you look up and realize the sky is an entirely different color. Diane stopped pretending. The warm smiles disappeared when Marcus left for work. The softness dropped off like a coat she'd been wearing all along. One morning, about 3 weeks after they returned from their honeymoon, Diane came downstairs while Zara was eating breakfast and looked at the bowl of cereal in front of her and said, with a tone so flat it was almost bored, "You didn't ask if I needed the kitchen first." Zara was 14 and eating cereal at 7 in the morning before school. She stared at Diane and didn't know what to say. That was the morning she understood that something had fundamentally changed and that she was in it alone. Over the next 3 years, the treatment got worse in a way that was systematic and calculated and cruel. Diane never hit Zara, and that was deliberate. There were no bruises, no marks, nothing that would raise an alarm. What Diane did was something quieter and in many ways more damaging. She stripped Zara of every comfort, every dignity, every sense of belonging in her own home, slowly and methodically, like peeling back layers until there was nothing left to protect her. Zara was given chores that no teenager should have been responsible for alone, scrubbing the bathrooms every day, mopping the floors, cleaning the kitchen after every meal, doing laundry for the entire household. If anything was done to a standard Diane did not approve of, there were consequences, not physical ones, but social ones. Diane would ensure that Zara had no dinner that night. She would tell Marcus that Zara had chosen not to eat, that she was being dramatic, going through a teenage phase. And Marcus, who traveled more frequently for work as the business grew, believed his wife. He had no reason not to. Zara would sit in her room at night, stomach hollow, staring at the ceiling of a house that used to feel like home, listening to the television downstairs and the sound of Diane laughing at something. She stopped inviting friends over entirely. Diane had made that impossible. Once, when Zara was 15, a friend named Keisha had come over after school, and Diane had sat across from them in the living room and made comments, just quiet, cutting remarks about Zara's posture, about the way she spoke, about how she hadn't finished her chores, each one delivered in a tone just low enough that Keisha wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. Zara saw the discomfort on Keisha's face and made an excuse to end the visit early. Afterward, Diane looked at her and said, "You should be grateful I let you have guests at all." Zara went upstairs and sat on the floor of her room with her back against the bed and cried without making a sound. She had mastered that, crying silently. She didn't want Diane to hear her. She refused to give her that. What Diane had also done, methodically and over years, was begin placing distance between Zara and her father. She would edit conversations, telling Marcus that Zara had said things she hadn't said, framing Zara's silence as rudeness, her sadness as attitude. When Zara tried to speak to Marcus directly, Diane was always there, always inserting herself, always redirecting. And Marcus, a man who was now managing a company with multiple properties and traveling frequently, trusted his wife to manage the household. He assumed the tension between his daughter and his wife was the kind of thing that happened between stepmothers and teenage girls. He didn't know. He genuinely did not know. And that was perhaps the most painful part for Zara. Her father was still the warmest person she knew. He just couldn't see what was happening right inside his own walls. When Zara turned 16, Marcus sat her down during one of his weekends home and told her he had set up a trust account for her. He told her that everything he had built was going to be protected for her future, that she would never have to worry, that whatever happened in life, she would have a foundation. He held her face in his hands the way he had since she was small and said, "You're my legacy, baby. Every single thing I built thinking about you." Zara held on to that conversation like a lifeline. She replayed it on the hard nights when she was hungry and exhausted and felt invisible in her own home. She told herself, "Hold on. You're going to be okay. Your father loves you and he has made sure of it." 9 months later, Marcus Williams collapsed in his office. A massive heart attack. He was 53 years old. He didn't make it to the hospital. Zara got the call during school, and she sat in the principal's office and felt the floor disappear beneath her. Everything went quiet. The world kept moving, people kept talking, but she was in a glass box where no sound could reach her. Her father, the man who was her entire foundation, was gone. And she was 17 years old, and she was now alone in a house with the woman who had been making her life a quiet, calculated misery for 3 years. The funeral was a production. Diane wore black and received condolences with a hand pressed to her chest. She cried in exactly the right places, at exactly the right volume. She held Zara's hand once during the service for a photograph, and then released it. Relatives came, aunts and uncles and cousins from both Marcus's side and from places Zara barely recognized. They patted her on the back and said her father was a great man and that they were praying for her. Then they went home. The house fell quiet. And Zara was left standing in it with Diane. Within 2 weeks of the funeral, everything changed in ways that Zara hadn't thought possible. The trust account her father had described to her, the one he said had been set up for her future, was gone. Not just inaccessible. Gone. Diane, as Marcus's legal wife, had worked with a lawyer to contest and redirect the estate. The details were buried in legal language that a 17-year-old with no independent counsel had no way of navigating. Marcus had intended to place everything in trust for Zara, but the paperwork had not been fully finalized before he died. Diane knew this. Whether she had known it all along or had discovered it only after Marcus's death was a question Zara would spend years turning over in her mind. Either way, Diane moved quickly and cleanly. She inherited the estate. The properties. The accounts. The business. All of it passed to her. Zara found out when she went to the bank with a letter her father had given her and was told that the account no longer existed under that structure. She stood at that counter and felt something cold move through her. She called the family attorney and was told that he now represented Mrs. Diane Williams and could not speak with her. She called an aunt on her father's side, Auntie Renee, and was told that the family had been advised not to get involved in legal matters and that she needed to speak to a professional. Zara was 17. She didn't have money for a professional. She didn't have money for anything. She went home, walked through the front door of the house her father had bought, and Diane was sitting in the living room with a glass of wine and looked up at her and said, without even changing her expression, "You'll need to start looking into options." Zara stared at her. Options? Diane shrugged slightly. "You'll be 18 in a year. You should start thinking about what comes next." That was the moment Zara understood the full picture. This had never been an accident. This had never been grief or mismanagement or legal confusion. This was always the plan. The next 12 months were the hardest of Zara's life. She was still in school, still showing up every day because school was the one place she felt she had any control over anything. Her teachers noticed something, though none of them fully understood what was happening at home. A counselor named Ms. Patterson, a warm, no-nonsense woman who had been at the school for 15 years, began checking on Zara in ways that felt casual but were deliberate. She'd ask Zara to help organize something in the counseling office after school, which was really just a way of giving her a safe, warm space to sit for an extra hour. She'd pass her a granola bar and say she had extras. Small things. But to Zara, those small things were the difference between feeling completely invisible and feeling like at least one person in the world could see her. At home, the conditions had become openly degrading. Diane had taken on a rotation of guests, business associates, friends, people she was clearly cultivating for the next chapter of her social life, and the house was frequently full of people who had no idea what the quiet girl who cleaned up after dinner had been through. Zara cooked. She cleaned. She stayed out of the way. If she made a mistake, if a dish wasn't done properly or if she was seen in a room Diane didn't want her in, the punishment was always the same. Silence and deprivation. No food, no acknowledgement, no communication. Diane had a gift for making a person feel like they did not exist. And for a girl who had already lost her mother young and then lost her father, the loneliness of it was a specific kind of pain that didn't have simple words. There were nights when Zara would go to her room, the smallest bedroom in the house, the one Diane had moved her into after Marcus died, and she would hold the one photograph she had of her father on her phone, because Diane had removed the framed photos from the walls, and she would just sit with it. She would talk to him quietly, the way you talk to someone when you're not even sure they can hear you but you need to believe they might. "I'm still here, Daddy," she would whisper. "I'm still here." She began writing things down. Everything. Dates, incidents, specific words Diane had said, meals she had been denied, situations where she had been deliberately humiliated. She kept a small notebook hidden in the lining of her backpack, and she filled it slowly and methodically the same way Diane had dismantled her life, quietly and with precision. She didn't fully know why she was doing it. It was instinct more than strategy. But something in her, some part of her that sounded a lot like her father's voice, told her to document everything. Don't let it disappear. Make it real on paper. 6 months before Zara turned 18, something happened that cracked the story open. One of Diane's frequent houseguests, a woman named Beverly, who worked in finance and had known Marcus professionally before his death, came to the house for dinner. Beverly had always been cordial to Zara, the polite kind of cordial that businesspeople use when they're unsure of a situation. But that evening, she arrived early and found Zara in the kitchen alone, scrubbing a pot with hands that were red and raw, dinner simmering on the stove, bags under her eyes from a week of poor sleep. Beverly stood in the doorway and looked at the scene for a long moment. She looked at Zara and said, very quietly, "How are you actually doing?" It was such a simple question. It was so direct and quiet and genuine that Zara's throat closed. She looked up at Beverly and opened her mouth to give the automatic answer, the fine, "I'm okay," the answer she had trained herself to give. But instead, her eyes filled with tears. She shook her head slowly. She couldn't speak. That was enough. Beverly didn't make a scene that night. She came to dinner, she was polite to Diane, she left at a normal time. But the following week, she reached out to Zara through the school. She had found the school's contact information and sent a message asking the counselor to let Zara know she had called. Ms. Patterson brought Zara in, handed her the message, and sat with her while she read it. Beverly had connected her with a nonprofit legal organization in Atlanta that specialized in estate disputes and cases involving minors who had been displaced by inheritance fraud. She had also spoken to a colleague who knew the attorney Marcus had originally worked with before Diane had redirected representation. And what came out of those conversations was a picture that was even more troubling than Zara had already understood. It appeared that Diane had been aware of the incomplete trust documentation long before Marcus died. There were communications that suggested she had quietly influenced the delays in finalizing the paperwork. The legal team could not prove that Marcus's death was anything other than a natural event, and they never made any claim otherwise. What they could prove, and what they began building a case around, was a clear pattern of financial manipulation and estate fraud, and the deliberate displacement of a minor from rightful inheritance. Zara handed over her notebook. Every page of it. Every date, every incident, every meal denied, every word Diane had said that she had written down in her careful, tight handwriting. The legal team was quiet for a long time when they reviewed it. One of the attorneys looked at her and said, "You kept all of this?" Zara nodded. "My father always said, if something matters to you, take care of it. Don't let it disappear." The attorney looked back down at the notebook. "He raised you right," she said. "The case took time, the way these things always do. Zara turned 18 in the middle of it, and the day after her birthday, she walked out of that house with a single bag and went to stay in a room that Beverly had arranged for her through a transitional housing program for young adults. She left quietly, early in the morning, before Diane was awake. She stood at the door of her old room for a moment and looked at the walls and the window where she used to watch the rain, and she thought about her father. She thought about him teaching her to ride a bike in the driveway of this house, about the way he would knock on her bedroom door and say, "Breakfast, baby," every single morning without fail. She thought about how much love had once lived in these walls. Then she picked up her bag and she walked out. She didn't look back. Not because she wasn't heartbroken. She was. But because she had learned in those years that sometimes moving forward is the most powerful thing a person can do. The legal case concluded 14 months later. The court ruled that Diane had engaged in fraudulent manipulation of the estate and had knowingly prevented the finalization of the trust that Marcus Williams had intended for his daughter. The estate was not returned in full, because some assets had already been moved and would take further litigation to recover. But a significant portion was recovered and placed in a proper trust for Zara. Diane was removed from the property and faced civil penalties. Several of the properties Marcus had built were returned to the estate. Zara was 19 years old, sitting in a lawyer's office on a rainy Tuesday in Atlanta, when she was told the ruling had come through. She sat very still. She didn't cry. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed slowly and thought about her father. She thought about him saying, "You are my legacy, baby. Every single thing I built thinking about you." Then she quietly said thank you, picked up her bag, and walked out into the rain, and she let herself feel it all. The grief and the relief and the anger and the love. All of it. At the same time. Standing on the sidewalk in the rain like a person who had walked through a fire and come out the other side still standing. Zara went back to school. She enrolled in a business program at a university in Atlanta, partly because it was what she had always wanted, and partly because it was what her father had always encouraged. She used part of the recovered funds to hire a small team to begin managing the properties that had been returned to the estate, just as her father once had, learning as she went, making mistakes and correcting them, treating the people she worked with the way her father had always treated people. With directness and respect and a refusal to be dishonest. Ms. Patterson, her old school counselor, came to her first official property meeting as a guest, because Zara had invited her, because she had never forgotten those granola bars and that one extra hour of warmth during the hardest year of her life. Beverly became an unofficial mentor, meeting with her quarterly, honest and practical in the way that good mentors are. And Auntie Renee, the aunt who had told her not to get involved, called Zara one afternoon, nearly 2 years after everything had concluded, and said she was sorry. She said she had been afraid and had made the wrong choice. She said she hoped Zara could understand. There was a long silence on the phone before Zara spoke. Then she said, "I understand, Auntie. I don't want to carry anything heavy anymore." And she meant that too. Not because what Renee had done was okay. It wasn't. But because Zara Williams had spent too many years in a house that tried to crush her spirit, and she had decided that she was not going to let anything else take up space inside her that didn't deserve to be there. There is something that stays with you about a story like this. Not just the cruelty of it, although the cruelty was real and it was deliberate and it deserves to be named. What stays with you is the girl. The girl who kept writing in her notebook even when she didn't know why. The girl who whispered to her father's photo in the dark. The girl who cried without making a sound because she refused to give her pain to someone who would use it against her. The girl who walked out of that house at 18 with one bag and still believed, somehow, that things could be different. That is not a small thing. That is an enormous, quiet, extraordinary kind of strength. The kind that doesn't come from having everything. The kind that grows, strangely and stubbornly, precisely when everything has been taken away. Marcus Williams built his legacy in real estate and business and numbers on a page. But the most important thing he ever built was the character of his daughter, and Diane, for all her calculation and patience and legal maneuvering, could never touch that. She could take the money. She could take the house. She could take the photographs off the walls and the food off the table and the comfort out of every room. But she could not take who Zara Williams was inside. And in the end, that was the only thing that ever really mattered. If this story moved you, if any part of it reminded you of your own strength or of someone you love who has been through something hard, drop a comment below. Tell us what you took from it. And if you're watching someone go through something like this right now, let this be your reminder. Show up. Ask the real question. Sometimes, how are you actually doing, is the thing that changes everything.